Now, a lot of lessons were learned in making Maniac Mansion. The dead ends and the deaths would all but disappear by the time Monkey Island came around. Puzzle structure would get refined, and we now had rules and guidelines for what made a good puzzle and how players should discover problems and solutions. Replacing the convoluted mess of a map that Gary and I had for Maniac Mansion with these well-structured puzzle dependency graphs, where you could look at the entire flow of the design in a single glance. Now, it's really easy to look back at games like Maniac Mansion, or any of the classic games presented this year, through this lens of nostalgia. It's easy to look at what they became and really make assumptions about what they were before they were anything. But for us, Maniac Mansion was just a game. It was a game that we spent many long months and late nights and seemingly endless weekends working on. Now, we loved it, we hated it, and our only dream for it was it really wouldn't run the company out of business. When Gary and I started making Maniac Mansion, we had a bunch of fun ideas, but we didn't have a vision for the future. We were not out to change the face of graphic adventures. We just wanted to make a game and not get fired. And I think if there's anything to learn from this talk, I think it's that we had no idea what we were doing. None whatsoever. And I think that's an important lesson. Because sometimes you just need to do things. And sometimes thinking too much and knowing too much can sometimes hurt more than it can help. Because sometimes I think it really is important to just be too stupid to know that it can't be done. Anyway, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Brian, and welcome to Drink the Video Games. Today we are talking about a game that laid the foundation of not only the types of games that LucasArts would come to be known for, but would bring about the tool that would help to create all of those memorable games. First released for Apple II and the Commodore 64 in 1987, on MS-DOS in 1988, and would even be ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System and adapted to a television series in 1990. Today we are talking about Maniac Mansion and its sequel, Day of the Tentacle.
Maniac Mansion, a new kind of comedy-adventure game, is scheduled to be on the shelves this fall. You direct a trio of teenagers in the exploration of a Victorian mansion, trying to rescue a friend who is being held captive. To save her, you must outwit a crazy doctor who is scheming to take over the world, one teenager at a time. Maniac Mansion is the first game we've published ourselves.
In Maniac Mansion, we will be taking on the role of Dave Miller to help him rescue his girlfriend Sandy Pants from the mysterious Edison family mansion. To help us on our quest, we recruit our friends Bernard, Jeff, Michael, Razor, Sid, and Wendy, who will all bring their own skills and personalities to the adventure. But beware, there are dangers and tentacles around every corner ready to throw us in the dungeon to thwart our efforts to save Sandy from the maniacal Dr. Fred, his wife Nurse Edna, and their son Weird Ed.
Now, when I started working at Lucasfilm, I started there in 1984, and I was a programmer working on the Commodore 64 version of Coronis Rift. Now, the Lucasfilm Games division was a small 7-person team that was a part of the Lucasfilm Computer division. And the Lucasfilm Computer division would go on to become Pixar at some point. And it was there working in the games group that I met Gary Winnick. And we became really good friends. Now, Gary and I both really enjoyed old horror movies. We like things like Reanimator. We love things like The Fly. There was this movie called Creepshow, which starred Stephen King. And he played this farmer, and a meteor crashed into his farm and slowly started to take him over. And this is really where we got the idea for the purple meteor that crashes and takes over Dr. Fred. Really kind of came from this movie. So as Chronicles was finishing up, Gary and I started talking about making some kind of a comedy horror game. And the Little Shop of Horrors had just came out. And we were really big fans of that game. And you can see where we kind of stole the idea for the man-eating plant in Maniac Mansion. Now, around the time we were thinking about Maniac Mansion, the Lucasfilm Games group moved from our offices in this industrial park up to Skywalker Ranch. Now, Skywalker Ranch is this large, sprawling ranch that George Lucas built in the hills of Marin. And the ranch was designed to look like a big family ranch. but it would actually house his company, Lucasfilm. Now, it consisted of several buildings. There was the main house, which was you could house George's office. And behind it, there was a collection of much smaller buildings. In the very back, there was the stable house. And the stable house is what housed the Lucasfilm Games group. I always thought it was amusing that we were in the stable house, back where the horses and stuff would have been. Now, a lot of the inspiration for the mansion in Maniac Mansion came from the main house. This is the main house at Skywalker Ranch, and George's office is up there on the 3rd floor. And you can see a lot of similarities in the main house and the mansion. And Gary and I were always poking fun of things that were, going on at the ranch, and this was just kind of our way of, poking fun of that stuff a little bit. The main house also had a library in it. And you can see the picture of the spiral staircase that was in the library at the main house, and the spiral staircase that is in Maniac Mansion. The main house also had a media room with a large screen TV, and back then that was actually a very large TV. The main house had a grand piano in it. We also had a nuclear reactor at Skywalker Ranch.
After finishing up work on Coronis Rift in 1985, programmer Ron Gilbert and artist Gary Winnick took on the task of creating a new game for the Lucasfilm Games group. So Gilbert and Winnick team up, and over their shared love of comedy and schlocky horror movies, the overall concept of Maniac Mansion begins to take shape, with characters being based off of friends, family, and coworkers, and settings based off of Skywalker Ranch, and antagonists pulled straight from cheesy horror films. The ingredients for the new game were beginning to take shape, but those ingredients needed a gameplay genre, and one would be found in the first of its kind graphical adventure game, King's Quest by Sierra Online.
Now, I'd spent a lot of time playing Colossal Cave on my university's mainframe, and I'd played all the Scott Adams adventure games and the Infocom text adventure games. And I really loved the genre of adventure games. But it was watching my 8-year-old cousin play King's Quest that really made Maniac Mansion just completely fall into place. It was like, of course, we'll make it an adventure game. And it was this eureka moment where everything just made sense. It's like all those weird disconnected ideas that Gary and I had just all completely, instantly fell into place. Now, I spent a lot of time playing King's Quest over that Christmas vacation just to see what they were doing. And it was my first exposure to a text adventure that had graphics, but they weren't just simple static pictures. They actually had animation on them. But there was one aspect of the game that I did not like at all, and that was the text parser. There were these graphics, and it was more than just a slideshow, but I still felt at some level that I was playing a text adventure. And I was getting very frustrated playing this game that I called Second Guess the Parser. You'd see a bush on the screen. You wouldn't know what to call it, so you type pick up plant, and it would say, I don't know what a plant is. So you type pick up, bush, and it would say, I don't know what a bush is. You type pick up shrubbery, and it would say, I don't know what a shrubbery is. So eventually I typed fuck you on there, and it would say, do you really need to swear? And I'm like, yes, I really do need to swear right here. So I'm looking at this bush or this plant or this shrub, and I can't really figure out what the game designer is calling it. And this was not gameplay to me. This was not fun. It's like, why can't I just point at this thing? I can just see it right there on the screen. I should be able to just point at it. And if I'm able to click on objects on the screen, the next logical step is why can't I just click on the verbs that are also on the screen? And really, despite the backs of the boxes and the marketing departments were telling us, there really was only a very limited set of verbs that these games actually understood.
So now that we know what kind of game Maniac Mansion is going to be, how are they going to make it? Laying out the game like an old-fashioned board game, the environments and puzzles begin to take shape, how the characters could move through the mansion, and how objects would interact to solve puzzles. And the pair was so proud of this early work, you can see the original design on a poster featured in the game.
And also did a system called SCUM, which was stood for Script Creation Utility for Maniac Mansion, which was Ron Gilbert and Gary Winnick were doing this game, which came to be called Maniac Mansion. I think that was my title. I was very good at naming things, so I ended up generating a lot of names for things. And they were struggling with some of the... And Ron has this insight. He said, wait a minute, most of the stuff that's compute-intensive, like rendering, that has to be, very tightly coded assembly language. But we only have to do that once. But the stuff that is kind of constantly under churn and being changed all of the time as we figure out what the hell we're doing and debugging, that's not performance intensive at all. So we could just have like a simple scripting language and just interpret that. And he comes to me, and because he knows I do like compilers and things, he says, "Can you write a compiler for this?" I said, "Yeah, I can write a compiler for that." And that resulted in Scum, which was the engine behind all of the Lucasfilm graphical adventure games. Also, I think the Humongous Entertainment games when Ron went off to form Humongous.
With the style of the game figured out, and the rough outline for how it's going to work, Ron Gilbert can get to work programming the game. There's a slight issue, though. The game was too big to be programmed with the language that Lucasfilm Games was using at the time. It was just going to take too long. So another game programmer, Chip Morningstar, comes up with the idea for Gilbert to create his own programming language, and would help him get one started, and thus the Scum, or script creation utility for Maniac Mansion, is born, and would change the trajectory of Lucasfilm Games and LucasArts for the next decade.
Yeah, I think my biggest memory from developing the Scum system for Maniac Mansion was what felt like to me at the time was almost getting fired by Steve. Because Gary and I had worked on Noah's game, Coronis Rift. I was hired to do the port from the Atari 800 to the Commodore 64. And while I was doing that, I befriended Gary Winnick, who's on the left or right, can't tell which side. And we, came up with this idea for this game called Maniac Mansion, mostly because we liked, B horror movies. And so we started working on it, and I think we'd probably worked on it for maybe 9 months, and Gary and I had a design, and the code was going nowhere because I was trying to code the entire thing in 6502 assembly language, which really was not working. And I remember at some point Steve called me into his office, and I remember we had a talking to kind of about the state of the game and how it was not progressing very far. And I also think this was the point that David Fox was brought onto the project as a scripter, and I think that's because Steve felt that the project needed an adult on it, which was the other thing. But as I was, kind of fumbling around with the 6502 stuff, I was talking to Chip, and, Chip had suggested, well, why don't you do like a scripting language? And, we'll build a compiler and an interpreter, and, all this seemed crazy to me on a Commodore 64, to write all this stuff. But, Chip actually convinced me that this would be doable, and I think Chip went off and wrote the first Scum compiler over lunch, which was very impressive. A couple of days. And really from that, came this whole adventure game scripting language, which, obviously went on to, power most of the Lucasfilm adventures, Maniac Mansion, Zack McCracken, and Monkey Island, and Sam & Max, and all of those games. But, I think, as other people have mentioned, I think it was that environment we had, which was very collaborative, and everybody worked together. And there was this kind of sense, well, except for me worried about getting fired, there was this there wasn't this fear of failure at some levels, and it really kind of allowed you to go off and do really interesting things. And as Chip had mentioned, I think a lot of the stuff we did, we were just kind of too stupid to know that it couldn't be done, and so we would just kind of go and do all of these really interesting things.
Meanwhile, as the programming begins to take shape, the art side of things can get started, with Gary Winnick doing the bulk of the character and background art. Basing the character models off of some concept art sketches he had made, Winnick would be pushing the Commodore 64 to the max. Now, the resolution for the Commodore 64 was 320 by 200 pixels, with a whopping 16 colors, so a program gets created by Gilbert to compress the artwork 2 or 3 times to meet the limitations of the system. As for characters, character sprites could be 24 pixels wide, which is just wide enough to give them all some facial expression, but not much else.
But the Commodore 64 also had what was called a programmable character set that allowed for the creation of custom characters, meaning that we could redefine what each of the characters looked like to be anything we wanted. And then by using this, we could create all the screens using these 8 pixel by 8 pixel tiles. And it reduced the amount of memory that we needed to scroll from 16K down to just 1K. But this presented a big problem for Gary and his art. creating the images for all these rooms out of little tiles was going to remove a lot of the charm that we saw in Gary's art. So I wrote this graphics editor where Gary could paint on the Commodore 64 screen and treat it like a real bitmap. And he would press a key, and it would go through, and it would try to reduce that screen into the character set. Now, the downside of using character sets is there was a limit of only 256 characters. And a lot of Gary's art would get compressed down to 300, 400, or 500 characters. So then the program would go through and it would try to find two characters that looked similar, not exact, but similar, and would just force one to look exactly like the other. And after multiple minutes of crunching, it would have reduced this image to 256 characters. But there would be a lot of glitches. So then Gary would go in and he would touch up those glitches back in bitmap mode. And after several iterations of this, we had images that had been crunched down to 256 characters, but they still retained a lot of the charm of Gary's original art.
One of the pioneering things that takes place in Maniac Mansion is the birth of the cutscene. Well, maybe not the birth, but it is held to be the first time that a cutscene is used in a video game to expand the game's narrative. In other words, the game could pull away from the action to tell some story elements of what was happening off-screen. This was revolutionary for the storytelling abilities of a video game, and really expanded the scope of how big a video game world could be.
Well, computer games obviously have changed quite a bit from the old days, and while spreadsheets and desktop presentations are nice, there are many of us who still find computer games one of the most wonderful benefits of the personal computer era. Today, we'll take a look at some of the best and newest computer games on the market. Now, one reason computer games have become so good is this marriage between film-style animation and sound and the interactive control of computers. There are perhaps no better practitioners of this technology than the wizards at Lucasfilm Studios in San Rafael, California.
What once was going to be a 6-month game development, Maniac Mansion would take somewhere between 18 and 24 months to go from concept to floppy disk, a 320 kilobyte Commodore 64 floppy disk to be exact. But now that the game was done, where was it going to go? At the time, Lucasfilm Games were primarily being published by Electronic Arts, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it. According to Rogue Leaders, The Story of LucasArts by Rob Smith, EA says a horror comedy adventure game would never sell. So Steve Arnold, the Lucasfilm Games Group general manager, decided to throw caution to the wind, to be bold, and to take George Lucas's advice to heart: stay small, be the best, and don't lose any money. Now, Lucasfilm Games was in the game publishing business, and the first game they would self-publish would be Maniac Mansion.
I actually think one of the really good constraints we had is that we were not working with Star Wars. We had the brand of Star Wars and the credibility of Star Wars and the franchise of Star Wars, but we didn't have to play in that universe. So what happened is we were a group that lived inside of a super creative, technologically astute company, and we got to do our own invention. We got to do our own creation. We were literally probably the only group outside of George inside of the Lucasfilm company that actually got to make up new stories and call them Lucasfilm. And so that gave us a fair amount of freedom and a fair amount of flexibility and also a fair amount of challenge. But I think that really helped us. I would argue that that helped us. Another thing that happened, and this is a little bit amusing reflecting on it many years later, but I was brought in as the general manager of the group with the idea of trying to figure out how we were going to go from a research group to a development group, a publishing group, without losing the kernels of creativity and innovation that was started by Peter and David and of several other members of the team who aren't here. When I first met with George and I got hired by the computer division folks, and I met with George, he said to me, stay small, be the best, and don't lose any money. Now, the good news about that sounds a little mundane at one level, but the good news about that was actually an incredibly liberating mandate, because it really gave us permission, and we didn't actually stay small completely, but we stayed pretty small for a while. But we were really driving towards trying to figure out how could we take the franchise that people were associating with George and Lucasfilm, which was innovative storytelling, apply it to this new interactive world, and so we invented lots of different things because we had permission to do that. I'll throw in one other thing and then toss it back, and maybe we'll talk about this stuff more later. One other thing we did intentionally, and this goes specifically to the question, could you do it today? Because we were sort of an indie the equivalent of an indie film company. We were a little more artsy and not only driven by commercial success. We certainly wanted to make games that people liked and bought, but we also wanted to make stuff that we thought and that people thought was innovative and pushed the edge of the envelope and the intersection of technology, creativity, storytelling, graphics, animation, all those dimensions. And so we developed a culture that was extraordinarily collaborative. And as Peter said, we almost never, even though we tried to make our deadlines, we almost never sacrificed funativity, which was our joking way of saying, is the game any fun, for a ship date. And we gave ourselves permission to do that because we always figured that if we knew a better way to do it, and at a certain point we had to push it out the door, but if we knew a better way to do it, or if they knew a better way to do it, it was worth trying to figure out whether we could actually make it better, make it more fun, make it more engaging. And we gave ourselves permission to do that for quite a long time. So,
after the game's release on Apple II and the Commodore 64 in 1987, the sales weren't breaking any records, but were steady enough, and the ports would be coming fast. MS-DOS in 1988, Amiga and the Atari ST in 1989, and there was one other port that would be a unique sort of history to itself. Maniac Mansion would be coming to the Nintendo Entertainment System.
It was also ported to the Nintendo NES. Now, the NES version of Maniac Mansion had to go through Nintendo's approval process, and it became heavily censored on things like renaming some of the in-game arcade machines like Kill Thrill. There was this statue depicting the horrors of nudity that had to be removed. There was this poster showing other nudity that had to be removed. But I think my favorite thing that Nintendo censored in the game was in the credits for the game. It says NES Scum System by, and then it listed the people who worked on it. And Nintendo was confused why we were referring to their NES system as scum. Why would we insult their console machine like that? We tried to explain to them that it was just the name of our development system, but in the end we just shook our heads and we just removed it. Oddly enough, Nintendo had no problem with putting a hamster in a microwave.
Ported and published by Jalico for the Japanese Famicom release in 1988, the game got changed quite a bit. The characters were redrawn, the rooms were stripped of their detail, and if you wanted to save the game, you need to write down a 100-character-long password. No thank you. So when Nintendo wanted to port it again for the North American version, Lucasfilm Games would step in to help. Specifically, Douglas Crockford would step in to help because Lucasfilm was busy working on other projects. In spite of the lengthy process of going through Nintendo of America's convoluted censorship process, the game does eventually publish on the NES in 1990. The port comes out great. There's cool new MIDI chiptune tracks, and now the game has a wider audience. Maybe a television-sized audience.
Maniac Mansion accentuates the positive as the looniest, sweetest family comedy of the year.
No matter what, through thick and thin, and no matter how strange your family may appear, the family stays together. They stay close-knit.
Experience Maniac Mansion on Sunday and Friday nights, only on the Family Channel.
According to Volume 12 from the summer of 1990 of the Lucasfilm Fan Club magazine, Lucasfilm animators Cliff Ruby and Alana Lasser conceive of the game being turned into a TV show and go on to pitch the idea to George Lucas. Now, Lucas is keen on the idea, so he calls up Atlantis Films in Canada to see about getting the show off the ground. Eugene Levy, yes, that Eugene Levy, is tasked with developing and writing the show. Now, the show and the game don't really share much in common beyond the mansion itself and a brief mention of the meteor, but Maniac Mansion, the TV series, would air for 3 seasons on YTV in Canada and on the Family Channel in the USA from 1990 to 1993. 1993 sounds like it's about time for a sequel. But before we tackle the sequel, let's take a quick break so I can get Michaela from Drink the Movies in here to help me figure out what that purple tentacle has gotten up to. Michaela, hello, welcome back to Drink the Video Games. How are you doing today?
I'm awesome, Brian. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you have been joining me as I've been making my way through the LucasArts point-and-click adventure games, and today we're talking about basically the very first adventure game that LucasArts did. Well, technically they did a version of Labyrinth, based on the Jim Henson film there, but then the next up was Maniac Mansion, and that kind of set the tone for what LucasArts was going to do. Have you ever heard of Maniac Mansion, Michaela?
Not until you had talked to me about it for this episode.
Okay,
So,
okay.
no.
So Maniac Mansion was also a television show, so I thought maybe you had watched the television show, but I never heard of the television show either until like way later in life. I definitely didn't hear about when it was on from like 1990 to 1993. But Maniac Mansion was pretty influential in terms of video games. It created like this whole genre that I've been talking about, the point-and-click adventure game. And it was so popular, in fact, that it spawned a sequel called Day of the Tentacle. Now, in the first game, there's a couple of tentacles, right? There's a purple tentacle, there's a green tentacle, and the purple tentacle is kind of like I don't know, they're kind of like the bouncer, I guess, at the Edison mansion. You keep running into him, he keeps grabbing you and stuff like that. That's not great. And in the sequel, the purple tentacle, it gets into a little bit of toxic sludge, it grows real big, and it decides to take over the world. So you have to travel through time to, basically stop this tentacle in its tracks before it can even begin. So what I thought we should do for the cocktail is make a purple tentacle that can be wee little or wee big, depending on, how you want to take it.
Yeah. Well, we've got just the thing here. The purple tentacle. Let's do a drink that can either be 2 shots, or you can combine it to like a mega, like a small cocktail margarita kind of thing. And it'll be purple. It'll be great.
It will. Yes, it will be great. And this one is a tasty one for sure. And that was kind of my inspiration. I wanted it to be purple to reflect the tentacle there, the purple tentacle that you're seeing in both of the games. And then, to be able to be either small or big, depending on how you wanted to do it. And I also wanted it to have tequila. I didn't really want it to have tequila, but it does. And tequila is the best. So
Tequila's not bad at all. So what we're going to do here, you're going to take a shaker tin and you're going to put some ice in it. Add an ounce of silver tequila, half an ounce of blue curacao, half an ounce of cranberry juice, half an ounce of grenadine, half an ounce of sweet and sour mix. Now, we could talk about sweet and sour mix. I recommend you make your own, but you can definitely find one that is fine for this purpose, right? You're going to shake this up in a shaker tin, and you're going to pour it into either 2 shots, or you just shake it up in the shaker tin and pour it all out into 1 glass with the ice in it, and that'll be nice and big. So there you go, big and small.
Big and small, absolutely. You can do it either way. Exactly right. So this is a little bit on the sweeter side, which is normal kind of for a shot, right? Most shots are kind of on the sweeter side, especially like a themed shot, kind of like this. So that's good. But if you're doing it on the full size, more of just like a margarita type of a thing, I think it's important to serve it over ice because it's going to cut through that sweetness a little bit as that ice melts, which is good. And I also really like the addition of salt on the rim of that margarita. And my picture, I didn't have salt on the rim just because I wanted to keep it nice and clean looking. But I think that the salt is a nice kind of thing there when you're talking about sweet stuff like grenadine and sweet and sour mix. And you mentioned making your own, Michaela. It's simple. It's basically if you're good at making simple syrups, it's just equal parts sugar and water. Bring that to a boil, good to go. There with your simple syrup. When I do my sweet and sour mix, you can tell me if you do as something different. I just do basically like equal parts of the simple syrup and lemon juice.
Yep, that is exactly what you do. And it'll keep. The great thing about any of these simple syrups that you can make, you can put them in your fridge, put them in a good container that's covered, and you can keep them for weeks at a time. So I recommend that. Usually the sweet and sour mixes, they tend to be extra like syrupy to me. And so if you're going to do this as a shot, that might be fine. But if you are going to do it as like a margarita, that's going to get real like syrupy in the back of your throat halfway through. And it might be less enjoyable that way. So if you make your own, it'll keep it nice and bright, but also sweet enough to where it's enjoyable the entire cocktail.
Absolutely. So that is the purple tentacle. Go ahead and mix it up, have a shot, or maybe if you get into that toxic sludge that the purple tentacle got into, maybe it's going to mutate itself into a larger full-blown margarita. So thank you so much for joining me, Michaela. I definitely appreciate you coming on to talk through this cocktail with me.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Ryan.
All right. And with that, let's get back to talk about the sequel, Day of the Tentacle.
I'm thirsty.
I don't think you should drink that. It looks bad for you.
Nonsense. It makes me feel great. Smarter. More aggressive. I feel like I could. Like I could. Like I could. Take on the world.
Releasing in 1993 on floppy disk and PC CD-ROM, The Day of the Tentacle follows the story of the purple and green tentacles from the first game, and our hero, Bernard, joined by his friends Laverne and Hoagie, will be sent on a quest through time to stop the evil purple tentacle before it gets the chance to mutate and take over the world.
Day of the Tentacle is a game where you walk onto the set of an old Bugs Bunny cartoon from the 30s, directed by Chuck Jones.
Nonsense.
Those games were fun. Those games had attitude. Tim Schafer and his crew was brilliant and wacky and funny. There weren't that many funny games around, and even today there's not that many funny games around.
With Maniac Mansion kicking off a string of successful adventure games for LucasArts, the company decides it's time to try out a sequel to that original game. And Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman were ready to head up their own game. And who better to lead the way? They had both worked on Monkey Island and Monkey Island 2, LeChuck's Revenge, with Ron Gilbert. They had similar senses of humor, and Gilbert and Winnick would be around to help with the planning and writing of the sequel before departing LucasArts in 1992 and 1993 respectively. Plus, Tim Schafer's first assignment at Lucasfilm Games was to playtest the Nintendo version of Maniac Mansion. The crew decides on a time travel idea coming from Ron Gilbert and start to lay out the new game.
Day of the Tentacle is the first game I was co-project leader on. Or project leader of any kind, along with Dave. We just had to figure out what we were doing, and we didn't really have any ideas for games. And they're like, how about a sequel to Maniac Mansion? We're like, yeah, we'll take it. We'll do it. And we'll do it together, so we're scared. Do it. It's really scary to run a project and think you got an idea and be like, this is my idea and I'm going to run it.
So the Edison family from Maniac Mansion is going to stay. Obviously the Tentacles would be there, and fan favorite Bernard from the first game is going to be our protagonist. 2 new characters get created, Laverne, based off an ex-girlfriend of Dave Grossman, and Hoagie, based off of a Megadeth roadie that Tim Schafer knew. The pair decided against having a full roster of playable characters, akin to the first game, feeling it wasn't necessary and would help streamline the production. Now, times had changed quite a bit in the PC world from the time Maniac Mansion released in 1987 to the time Day of the Tentacle goes into production, so the way the game looks could have a lot more character and playfulness than the first one did. Concept artist Larry Ahern and background artist Peter Chan looked to the Looney Tunes for inspiration, and what we're left with is bright, slightly exaggerated, and cartoonish look for this sequel.
Day of the Tentacle was, we call it the first talkie, because it was like the very, very first fully voiced game.
And that was not the original plan to do voice at all.
No.
We were not going to do it, and while we were making the game.
But display limitations weren't the only thing that had increased. The size of games and PC memory had increased too. By a lot. When the game went into production, CD-ROM drives existed, but were pretty few and far between, but by the end of 1992, when the game was intended to be finished, that was no longer the case. CD drives were everywhere, and realizing that the game was running behind schedule, the team, at the suggestion of general manager Kelly Flock, decided this would be the perfect opportunity to change formats and let Tamlin Barra get some voices into the game, making this the first LucasArts game to have a fully voiced version available on launch.
For me, it was a great pleasure because I had been hired full-time. In 1991, I was hired as a contractor, and I lived here in Marin County and worked on Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis and Monkey Island 2. And then there was a brief pause while I went back east for a while. And when I returned, that was the hot project, is Maniac Mansion 2, Day of the Tentacle. And what was so inviting about that project was this kind of jaunty Danny Elfman approach to the music. Very comic, very comedic, but also very rooted in responsible, skilled writing for a pit orchestra, for the kind of pit orchestra that might be in a vaudeville play or comedy. And so Peter, I would say, Peter McConnell led the charge on creating kind of some germ themes and approaches to those sorts of textures. And then I actually completed the main theme for the intro sequence, which was just a great pleasure because it's a big, long thing, as you know, the car driving through everything. And all 3 of us contributed equally to the entire score. And I think we broke it up mostly in terms of the past, present, and the future.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm trying to remember how we broke it up, but I'm thinking that you might have been the future?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think Michael was the future and I was the past and Peter was the present, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, one of the things that we discovered in Maniac Mansion Day of the Tentacle was the power of looking to film score greats like John Williams or Richard Wagner. I mean, you know, the notion of leitmotif and the notion of attaching a theme to a specific character or a specific, in this case, location in time, or in the case of Monkey Island, to a particular island, etc. And having these multiple themes all be available to draw upon to create derived material. And that created a cohesive score. So one of the great themes is Hoagie's theme. And Hoagie was the big rock and roll fan, you know, with the long hair and the backwards baseball hat. And I think Peter wrote that theme. But the idea was to create these leitmotifs and these themes so that there would be cohesiveness in the score. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was one of the qualities that helped distinguish the LucasArts scores back then.
And as for the music, let's get the band back together from Fate of Atlantis. Clint Bajakian, Michael Land, and Peter McConnell would divide and conquer the scoring for the game. And with that, LucasArts is ready to press this onto a CD, or 6 floppy disks, and send it out into the world. With the game released, the reviews were rolling in, and they were pretty great. Winning PC Adventure Game of the Year in 1994 from Computer Gaming World, the game would instantly be at the top of best of lists and remain there throughout the next decade and a half, making it on the top 100 games of all time lists from IGN in 2005 and 2007, and GameSpot names it on its best video games of all time list in 2004. As for the sales, it's estimated that Day of the Tentacle sold around 80,000 copies by 2009, which was more than enough to justify its $600,000 budget. Plus, Bernard and crew were going to get another shot at greatness in 2016.
When we started this talk about remastering the old games, I was thinking about all the games that I'd worked on, Grimm and Throttle and Day of the Tentacle. It was always sad that you couldn't play those games legally. They're like just not available anywhere. And the fans did a really good job of keeping them working. But there's things that only we knew, like where all the concept art is and what things were supposed to look like and sound like and what they sounded like before they were compressed or edited. And I was like, I think we can find all that stuff. And we can add commentary and things like that only the people who actually worked on it could add.
Following the success of Tim Schafer's Double Fine Productions remaster of Grim Fandango, feelers get put out for other potential LucasArts classics, and Day of the Tentacle Remaster gets released on PS4 in 2016 and eventually on the Xbox in 2020 to rave reviews, both from newcomers to the genre, as well as those of us who remember them from our gaming past. Maniac Mansion was important, and you should play it. It's old and dated, a little clunky, and that's what makes it both endearing and enduring. It took a chance at creating its own genre, the point-and-click adventure game. It took the guesswork out of adventures and created new ways to tell us stories on our screens. Its sequel, Day of the Tentacle, keeps the charm and humor from the first game, but elevates it to a higher level, blending fantastic voice acting, lovely visuals, with the creative exploration that adventure gamers love. As for me, my first experience with Maniac Mansion was the Nintendo port. Not the ideal way to play an adventure game, sure, but there was something about it. Never owning it myself and only having it a few days at a time from our local library never let me fully understand how monumental the game was until I started doing some research for this podcast. Having played it now a few times on Steam, I'm glad to have it included in the video game experiences that I've had. As for Day of the Tentacle, I snagged it up quick on the remastered version after never having played it on the PC all those years ago. Tim Schafer, Double Fine, Grim Fandango were the only things I needed to see on the advertising to sell me on picking it up, and I'm glad that I did. So let me know what your history is with the Maniac Mansion franchise. Did you play the game on your PC back in the day, or have you gotten into it more recently on Steam, or the remastered version of Day of the Tentacle? Did you watch the TV show, or check out the NES port? Let me know down in the comments, and be sure to let me know if you mix up a purple tentacle to have while you're going through the game. And if you want to journey to the mansion with me, I'll be playing through both on the YouTube channel, so make sure you are following Drink the Video Games over there. Thank you so much for joining me on this look at Maniac Mansion. Like, subscribe, and rate the podcast wherever you're listening. It helps me get more video game goodness to everyone. Thanks again, cheers, and we'll be back next month for our final, at least for now, LucasArts point-and-click adventure.